Welcome into the Thinkeeper podcast. I'm your co-host, Joe Wilkie, joined as always by Jack Wilkie and Will Harrub. And we have a part two episode, kind of. I guess it would be a part two. We're very excited to have Dr. Harrub on the podcast. But before we get to that, we're going to have part two and I think a part three. And so we're excited. But fellas, it's Thanksgiving week. And so happy Thanksgiving to all our listeners out there. And I do have a question for you as we get to, when we think about the Thanksgiving meal, what's the best part of the meal? Because I'll say turkey's not near the top for me. I don't
very
think
overrated,
it's part.
right? Yeah,
it's very overrated, and I don't know that
I'm
it's
going to
the
say
top
though,
of
it's
anybody's.
popular in recent years to like slander the turkey. Hey, we're going to have turkey. Some people are like, no, we're just going to have
absolutely.
ribeye. No, you have to have the turkey, even if it's
You
not
have
that great.
to have turkey.
Agreed.
Respect tradition.
Right, I agree with that.
But you're right.
But Mom
there's
also
better
makes a
things.
honey baked ham. The honey baked ham, and then especially having the sandwiches after. Ooh, so what is the number one? What's your go to at a Thanksgiving?
So we're all very big Thanksgiving fans on here. Big Christmas fans too, of course. But Thanksgiving is my favorite day of the year. Man, so many different things to choose from. I am a believer that ham is superior to turkey on Thanksgiving Day. But if I had to just, one dish, I got to go with dressing. I know some of y'all call it stuffing. My mom's dressing is some of the best stuff I've ever tasted. So that is what I look forward to on Thanksgiving Day every year. Really not a competition. And I think it's mainly because we don't really eat it much any other time of the year. You know, the mashed potatoes, the corn, the rolls, we eat that, other times of the year. But man, dressing is where it's at for me on Thanksgiving Day.
I like your idea of the kind of Thanksgiving specific things. Mine is the
Right.
sweet potato casserole, not the marshmallow one, but the brown sugar butter, that one.
Pecans.
Yeah. And so, that's top for me. The other end of the spectrum, bottom, is the other orange thing, pumpkin pie. Of course, everyone knows. But Joe, what about you?
I am not a big fan of stuffing or dressing or whatever. I've never liked it. No offense, Will. Never liked it. Always thought it was dry. I just can't get into it. Same with apple pie. A good pecan pie, I used to not like it. A good pecan pie is tough to beat. Sweet potato casserole, I used to not like that either. Thanksgiving was never a big deal for me, but now I'm kind of coming back around. So I'd say Thanksgiving, or I would say sweet potato casserole. And then there's specific things that are made by my family and by my in-laws as well. And, we gravitate each year toward one or the other. We switch back and forth. And so I'm always lucky because on the one, they make a delicious chocolate dessert. My in-laws do. And on the other, we get some rolls from Sharon Bryant. And they have rolls as well that are really good. But Sharon Bryant's rolls, shout out to Sharon Bryant.
They are good.
Unbelievable rolls that we get like once a year. And I could down
That sounds
like
delicious.
10 of those things. So yeah, it's fantastic stuff. But anyway, to our listeners, post in the comments. Obviously, we haven't even gotten into the episode. Post in the comments with your favorite Thanksgiving dish or side dish or whatever
Let
it is.
us know
Maybe
how
if
much you
have
disagree
something.
with Joe about how great dressing is.
True.
Because clearly Joe's right about a lot of things, man. He's way off about this one.
That's
I don't
almost a
even
hot
know.
take with Joe moment, yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah,
Freezing
it's just
cold
not
take,
good.
more like it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to do biscuits and cornbread and separate them, sure, great. But throwing like sage and thyme and rosemary and I just not going to be able to do it. So, I guess that is a hot take. Either way, let
Shout
us
out
know
to the deep
what
thinkers,
your,
though.
what your favorite
we
things
are thankful for you. I'm going to throw that in there. We're thankful.
Very true.
That people get on and listen to us every week. It's kind of crazy to me that sometimes people do, but we sure have a lot of fun, and we love hearing from you guys. Love talking to you guys, and yeah, thank you guys for listening. We're very thankful to be able to share God's word and this, I don't know, just this kind of mindset, this worldview with you guys. So that's something I wanted to say before we got going. Anything you guys got before we get into the episode?
Very well said.
Thankful for you, fellas. Yeah, thankful for
Likewise.
you. Thankful for this podcast, and thankful for everybody listening right now. And so with that, we're going to get into the episode with Dr. Brad Harrub.
So we are back with part 2 of the discussion that we started last week about God's purpose and design for sex. And just as we started last week's episode with, we'll do the same thing here. We know a lot of our listeners listen with their families or listen with their children. We are going to leave it up to your discretion, depending on your children's ages, whether or not you think this is something they should be listening to. Again, if you listen to the last one, then hopefully you know kind of the direction that we went. And so we'll leave that up to your discretion. But to continue on, we have a special guest involved in his premiere episode of Think Deeper. It's kind of crazy. We've been doing this for a year now, and he was on a Think Fast with us, but this is the first time he's been on Think Deeper with us. We've got my dad, Brad Harrub, who has joined us. We talked a lot about, again, last week about what is God's purpose for sex? What is his design for it? We know that the world has misconstrued it, has twisted it, has perverted it, but we also got into the fact that the church, in a lot of ways, has simply not done an adequate job of teaching about sex, of covering sex with young people in any way. And so we kind of focused on that aspect again, God's design, God's purpose, and the way that has been misconstrued by both the world and the church. And so there's a few different areas that we wanted to tackle with this part 2 episode. And we wanted to bring Brad on for several reasons to discuss some of the things having to do with birth control, reproduction, the IVF question. Those are things that we'll hit later on in the episode. But to start, I don't know whether to call you Dad or Brad. I'm just going to stick with Dad. Brad doesn't sound normal, so I'm going to stick with Dad. But Dad, welcome into this week's episode.
You could mix him and call him Brad. Okay, sorry.
Okay, that was a bad joke. That was a dad joke.
Dad joke. Yeah, Brad and a friend. Okay, never mind.
Pretty bad.
So anyway, good try there, Joe. But Dad, you listened to last week's episode. Go ahead and tell us maybe what are some things we left out. What are some things that you wanted to cover in this part 2 episode?
Hey, it's great to be with you guys. So let's start with the obvious. My background is in anatomy. And one of the things that I don't know that you guys covered in detail last week was just the beautiful design that God put in men and women. There is a reason why in the Bible it talks about a one flesh union, because the male and the female bodies were designed to come together in such a way. One of the things, firsthand, Melinda and I were very, very purposeful about making sure that our children heard about sex, number one, from us, but also from the perspective that it is good, it is God designed. And you may remember we used a kit, so to speak, it's called Passport for Purity. I highly recommend it. I think Dennis Rainey is the guy who did that. It's actually supposed to be a 1 to 2 day weekend kind of deal where you get away with your child, and by the time the thing is over, they know everything. There are experiments, there's all kinds of stuff, but one of the reasons we are so passionate about it is it presents it from a biblical perspective that this is good, and it describes in very good detail everything that somebody needs to know, whether that be a young person talking about the design of the human body and what to expect as they grow older, but also what the body is for, how babies are made, et cetera, et cetera. And so, one of the things that I feel like maybe we glossed over last week was just the fact that you got a lot of nerve endings in certain areas of the body that are there. God put them there for the purpose of arousing, for making erogenous zones, so that you are stimulated in those areas, or that your spouse can pleasure you in those areas. And it's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to shy away from. It's God's design.
Well, I can't remember if we discussed this or not, but just the very design of the male penis and the woman vagina, the one being her receiving and him being more on the, giving and forceful is not the right term, but you know what I mean? Like it's his is to kind of be the leader, so to speak, and hers is to receive that. And so there's built in the design of the sexual organs themselves is hierarchy and is kind of the design for a man being the head of a woman, right? Like he is to help her in those ways, and she's to receive that. And there's to be both sides grateful for the position that they've been given in the marriage. And so I think that's such a valuable point that you're making, even about the way God designed the nerve endings to stimulate one another in their erogenous zones, and the way that and you can get into this, doesn't that release a few chemicals? We're talking oxytocin, some pheromones, things like that. I wonder if you can get into that a little bit about the release of chemicals that come from the touch and from sex itself.
So probably everybody listening to this can remember, go back in your mind to when you were 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, and the very first time that you held hands with somebody of the opposite sex, and the feelings that released in your body. Today you hold hands with somebody and it may not do that same thing. The difference is this: when you were younger, when you were first experiencing that, it triggered the pleasure center of your brain. Dopamine was released. It was just like taking a hit of whatever, whether that be a drug or chocolate or whatever causes somebody pleasure. As you mature in your relationship, it actually converts over, and you guys did mention this last week, to oxytocin, which is basically a deeper, more feeling oriented kind of chemical release where, when two people are bonded together, you get a totally different neurochemical response. And again, go back to all of this is God designed. One of the things that I gotta get on to y'all about last week, nobody mentioned the fact that women are crock pots, men are microwaves. Big difference in the sexual gratification time of men and women. And your job is to make sure that the meal is cooked and everything's done on the same time, so that there is pleasure for both the wife and the husband.
Which gets us into foreplay and things like that, right? Why it's so important, and why most husbands, I think, want to go right into sex without having wooed his wife sufficiently. And even so, not even with foreplay, doesn't it also go to having the emotional connection? Because I also find, I think most married couples will find, like, if you had a fight or whatever and you come back together, you work through it, you talk through it. They call it makeup sex, but I do believe that there is a seemingly biological and certainly an emotional response where you get more aroused and the sex seems to be very fulfilling when you have come together in this emotional bond where you're working through problems together, you're listening to each other's sides, you're talking about it. Seemingly, when you are emotionally ready, that is when the sex seems to be best, in my opinion. And once again, the makeup sex seems to be something that people are well aware of.
Well, from a anatomical perspective, there's a lot that goes on in the female body to make her more receptive. And I think it's one of those things that guys, we don't think of, we don't spend enough time really focusing on. But, and I'm not going to get into all the technical details, but I'll simply say this: a female's body, if there has been the appropriate sensuality throughout the day, if you have treated her the way she's supposed to be treated, if you have loved her the way Christ loved the church, then later on, when that time happens, her body is going to be much more receptive and ready for sexual intercourse. If you haven't done all those things, it's not going to be. And so it's something that as men and as husbands, you got to keep that in mind, that, hey, sex doesn't start in the bedroom. It starts hours before in the kitchen.
Well, and this is sorry, real quick. This is very real life, practical type of a discussion that we're having, that, to be quite frank, a lot of young people are getting, even if, let's say, they're not consuming pornography, which, again, statistically, a lot of young men most likely are. But even if they're not, what are they consuming through Hollywood? What are they consuming through the shows they watch, the movies, the music that all portray this, idea of sexual intercourse as basically it leaves out all the things that y'all are discussing. It leaves out the emotional connection. It leaves out the, throughout the day, but between a husband and wife, the throughout the day interaction that leads to the sexual intercourse. And again, not just young people, but what do we see in Hollywood movies and shows and songs? Kind of skips over that part. And so I think that's why a lot of people, and again, specifically young people, kind of have a messed up view of what sexual intercourse between a husband and a wife is all about, because they're basing it off of what they see in Hollywood.
Well, I think one of the others, with kind of that stereotype, and we spoke about it a little bit last week, but something you want to get into as well today is the woman isn't just there to say, okay, well, the guy needs it, I'm supposed to provide it for him, so I will. But when you kind of take this shortcut route to it, it becomes that of, okay, I've got to perform, I've got to give him what he needs, and that's it. Whereas, like you're saying, really putting the time into this is what makes the difference, really makes it to where she can enjoy it too, that it's equal, that it's 50-50 out of this, and it's not just a sense of duty. It's not, all right, fine, I'll give you your little short time, and I took care of your biological need, but she, and again, it's that build up. It starts maybe in the morning or whatever else, and I think we hit on our masculinity femininity thing, that it's kind of this stupid dishonest trope that's out there of nothing is sexier to a woman than a man doing dishes in the kitchen. That just gets her going. Like, no, it actually doesn't. Physically, it just doesn't. But attention does, and care and touch and things like that. And just, again, showing, hey, I value you. I'm interested in you.
Words.
Kind words.
Yep.
Let's work toward this.
Absolutely.
Long before we get into the bedroom. So it becomes that for her too.
And what's interesting to me,
the other.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say, what's interesting for me is guys want kind of the immediacy of sex, right? And that's, I think, one of the issues is they don't want to put in the work for 2 hours wooing their wife, and things like that. But they'll masturbate and edge for 2 hours looking at porn. And they might do that a couple times a day. And it's like, if you took that time where you want sex immediately with your wife, but you don't view porn that way, like if you took that time and really put it into trying to, help your wife along and to connect with her and to do all of that, I think the guy just wants it immediately. And I think, Brad, you're right that statistically and biologically, I wouldn't say it's a rule across the board that every guy is, just that way. But at the same time, the overwhelming majority of guys are that way, where they heat up very, very fast. It takes some time to get, as we're talking about with your wife along, start viewing it that way of you're really putting into the relationship. And even if sex isn't on the back end, your relationship is that much stronger for it. But sorry, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say too, we got to throw into this discussion the difference, especially neurologically, that happens if you see, for instance, a hammer laying on a counter, a certain parts of your brain lights up. That is a tool. That's a tool you use for something. If your children or your grandchildren walk in a room and you see them, a different portion of your brain lights up. It's been proven. I can show it to you. So there's these two different parts of your brain that light up when you've got a tool or an object versus something that you love and care about. The problem with pornography and the problem with not taking care of and being sensual with your wife is she becomes the hammer or the tool and is viewed as an object. And number one, that's not a good thing. I think Jack last week was talking about the fact that, look, we've got this in a good way. Like Christians have got the total package. They've got this thing that's just useless, that's trying to fill a void that they can't fill. Well, part of it is because they're viewing their partner as a tool or an object rather than somebody they love. And there is a difference in the sexual relationship when you view that person as somebody you love, the neurochemicals that are released and everything that goes with it. And that's a big deal. I think our wives know when they're being viewed as a hammer or a screwdriver or a nail or a tool versus somebody that you truly love, care about, want to protect, and would be willing to die for.
Okay, so with that, we've been on kind of this side of it of men making it better for their wives, making sure it's enjoyable, fulfilling for her. You've got a to-do list for husbands, to-do list for wives. So before we switch to the, hey, wives, here's how you help your husband in this, let's get to your to-do list for husbands. What are things they can do throughout the day, just regularly, habitually, to make it more fulfilling for them, for their wives, for making it to where it's equal, the 50-50 thing we talked about. So what do you got on your to-do list?
All right, as far as a to-do list for guys, probably the first and the foremost thing that I would say to everybody, and this steps on my own toes, is put your phone down and look at your wife. Think about the message that you're really sending to your spouse when they're wanting to talk to you, they're wanting your attention, and yet you've got a device in your hand. Ultimately, what you're telling that person is this is more important than you. And so don't be sitting there looking at your phone all day and then wondering why your wife has no interest in you at night, because all day long you've been telling her, hey, this is more important than you. As far as a to-do list, other things, what about just taking time, giving her some time, whether that be for her to have some free time to do things she needs to do, time where you say, hey, you go grab some coffee, hang out with your friends. I'm gonna watch the kids. Take the time to show some affection, some sensuality, do little things like just sweet kisses, nibbling necks, nibbling ears, holding her, giving a hug that lasts more than 0.5 seconds that you think, hey, this will lead to the bedroom. Caressing. I don't know really of any women out there who probably don't like a massage, whether that be massaging their back, massaging their feet. But I'm going to say this, and again, guys, is one of those things you gotta go with me on. Just because you're rubbing her shoulders or her feet, that doesn't mean you immediately run back to the bedroom. Sometimes you may want to do that just to show her I love you, and without all the strings attached. Listen to how she's feeling. Talk to her about her goals, her aims, her dreams in life. And you guys talked a little bit about this last week, and I thought you did a good job. And that is, date your wife, get reinvested in her so that she understands she is priority number one. As far as wives, remember that your husband is very, very visual. It is a scientific fact. Guys are more visual than females. And so think about those visual cues and think about how those visual cues stay with him throughout the day, throughout the week. Learn to initiate, show him that you love him equally. There's a lot of Christian women out there, wives who, they don't mind having sexual relations with their husband, but they never ever initiate, or they never ever show, the first response. And ultimately, one of the messages that you're sending your husband is kind of the, this isn't important enough to me, or I don't necessarily desire you. And so, yeah, I'll be here for you, but you're not necessarily my first and foremost desire. Maybe the kids are, maybe cleaning house, or maybe my career, or whatever. Don't do that. Learn to initiate, learn to show him that you love him equally. Also, don't be afraid to flirt. Don't be afraid to whisper romantic things in his ear on occasion. Don't be afraid to mix things up occasionally. Sex in a bedroom is great, but it doesn't have to be that for 50 years, one thing over and over and over. Don't be afraid to mix things up.
I think two things that I get out of both of those, one thing I get out of each, but I think those are fantastic points. I love what you said for the husband side of don't always expect sex out of it. It's so easy to get into that of like, I'm doing this because there's kind of the reward at the end. And those are all the jokes from the culture, right? He's just trying to get some, whatever it is, the crude remarks that are made. And so it turns any affection you give your wife, any time you give your wife, there's always that expectation at the end that sex is coming. And I would say, if that is you and you realize that every single time you even touch your wife, every single time you're nice to your wife, you expect a reward. I mean, it's like Pavlov, man. Like you ring the bell.
Yep.
It's a conditioned response that somehow you think ought to be a conditioned response. It's not. Take care of your wife. I love that. I think that's a fantastic point. To the woman's side of it, though, you said this briefly, and I want to come back around to it because it was so good. As you talked about, date your husband. This is Gottman's Love Maps, right? John Gottman. Look up 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. Fantastic marriage book. Get it. Fill out the love maps with your spouse. That's part of the dating. But to the women, look, you chose your husband. Your kids, of course, they are came from you, and it is a fantastic thing, and you love your kids to death. There's nothing like a mother's love. At the same time, you chose your husband. So when you show that you put the kids above the husband, that you put the house chores, that you put everything above your husband, the husband knows. Like this, and that's a big thing is, well, how can I get mad at her? She's taking care of the kids. But the husband grows in this animosity and in this kind of underlying just frustration bubbling up underneath, and he can't figure out why. And then once again, I get him in therapy where there's just this frustration. And the reality is she hasn't considered him at all. She's considered the kids, and he goes, can I really get mad at her for that? Well, yeah, you can. You can get frustrated. You grow very frustrated because the reality is she chose you, but she's not choosing you anymore. She's choosing the kids. She's choosing her career. She's choosing other things. So to the women, your kids are going to move out one day. Lord willing, if everything goes well, your kids are going to move out one day. You and your husband aren't. That's the plan, is for you guys to be together for life, not for your kids to be in your house for life. And so put into the relationship now. A lot of people, and this is the empty nesters, they put 0 into the relationship. The woman runs into the kids. She just wants to have more and more kids because it's an escape from her horrible marriage. And then the kids move out and they go, well, what do we have to talk about? Yeah, it's because you haven't worked on your marriage in the last 25 years while you've been raising kids. All you've thought about is releasing those arrows. That's fantastic. But what happens when they're released? Then what do you do?
I think there's one thing I want to add to Brad's list is it's not one size fits all. My wife and I have talked about it to illustrate it to like making coffee for your spouse. When you get married, I got to figure out how she likes her coffee. If I think she's going to like it exactly like I do, and I just, hey, well, here, I would want this, so she's not going to want that. The other side being, well, women like their coffee this way. And like you kind of go online, well, how does a woman like her coffee? And you just kind of get, kind of cultural answer. Well, that might not be how she likes it. That might not be, she might be a little different. Joe brought up last week, some men's sex drives are higher or lower, some women's are higher or lower. Like you figure these things out. And so you really have to figure out, well, what, and both have to, and this is a very scriptural thing of putting each other first. What do you enjoy? What helps you enjoy this better? What makes this better for you? Not what do I think women like in general, not what do I want you to do to me, because I think that's a habit we get into. If I want you to do this to me, so I'm going to do it to you so you understand I want that. Communicate out that. How do you like your coffee made? Well, how do you like being approached? What do you enjoy? What do you not enjoy? I mean, that's one of those things, so many times you kind of do this and like, well, why are you not enjoying this? Because you're supposed to. Well, maybe she just doesn't. Ask.
Well, and it's a whole lot easier if somebody tells you what they like in your coffee, which is why communication is such a big deal. If you put in cream in her coffee for 15 years and lo and behold, you finally find out she doesn't really like cream. Well, we could have fixed this a long time ago had you said, I don't like cream. And same thing happens in the bedroom, so to speak. If you learn how to communicate what you like, what you don't like, those kind of things. Something else I'm gonna, as far as the to-do and not to-do list, let me throw this out there real quick. Lots of folks, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they have very busy lives. And a lot of times, the one time that they have to really talk to their spouse is at night, kids are finally in bed. Okay, we can actually communicate together. And what happens, I think, in lots of homes is that's when the business of the house, the family, all the things that are going right, but more often all the things that are going wrong get brought up. And what happens is, in too many cases, husband and wife find themselves talking about very negative things. Well, the bank account doesn't have a whole lot in it. The hot water heater is dripping. The car needs the oil change. The kid got in trouble at school. We've got to go and get cleats for this particular sports thing. And so instead of nursing a atmosphere of intimacy and feeding and fertilizing your relationship,
it's just a bunch of negativity. Right.
Yeah, you're basically running a business. And a lot of times it's the negative aspect of the business. So my thing would be learn to save some of that for a different time of the day. Because you don't need to right before you're wanting sex, be talking negative things to each other. And basically both of you get in a foul mood.
So one of the things I want to bring up, because that kind of spurs us on to that next area, and that is the sexual difficulties that can occur within a marriage. You think about what happens with a man and a woman before they're married, and you think about, and we sort of touched on it last week, how they want to, how much they want to be together, how much they want to get to know each other. They're trying really hard within the relationship. Far too often, what happens after they get married? First 2 or 3 years, maybe are good, but after that, they kind of stop trying. And the example that I give a lot is with weight and with fitness. If somebody is trying to pursue someone, they're not married, they want to end up with somebody. Typically, what are they going to do? They're going to take care of themselves, right? They're going to try to look nice. They're going to try to exercise. They're going to try to stay in shape. Something I've noticed just personally with people my age is that, again, far too often what will happen is they'll get married, and within 3 or 4 years, all that kind of goes away. They kind of let themselves go a bit. And it's almost like the analogy of the contract year with the athlete. They're in the contract year. They really want that contract. So they're going to, play really hard. They're going to go above and beyond, do everything they can to get that contract. And then a lot of times what happens after they get the contract? They kind of slack off. They've got the guaranteed money, so they're not going to try as hard. I see that a lot. And not just talking about with fitness and with health, but also this applies with the sexual tension that is within a marriage. So I think, Dad, I want you to speak to that. How much of that does that play in with the kind of, I'm going to try really hard, I'm going to push for this before we get married, and then 3 or 4 years after we get married, I've already got the girl, I've already got the guy, so what reason is there to try? How much of that have you seen? Does that play into this at all?
There's a George Strait song that's titled "She Let Herself Go," and if you listen to the song, it's actually a play on those words, but basically that's what you're saying is
right.
What happens if the man or the wife says, I've got a ring, so now I can just let myself go? That is not a recipe for success in a marriage, and it's certainly not a recipe for success when it comes to the purpose of sex, what we're talking about right here. If I allow myself to eat everything that I want to eat and I balloon up to 300 pounds, guess what? My wife's probably not going to find me very attractive and probably not going to want to be, as romantically active with me in the bedroom. So you've got this problem. How do we fix the problem? You take care of yourself. You take care and you encourage your spouse in the same area.
Well, and again, it's not just the fitness side, because that's exactly right. It's also doing the sweet things for your spouse, right? You do it a lot before you get married, and then it kind of goes down the drain. It's the emotional connection, the talking about things. Man, a lot of times once the wedding happens 5 years down the road, like you brought up, Dad, it's we've already done the emotional connecting part. Now let's just run the family business together.
Yeah. So you guys mentioned in the last podcast a 7-year itch, which you don't have to have, by the way. Here's the anatomical side of the 7-year itch. Too many guys and gals get really, really addicted to that hit of dopamine that they had when they were courting or dating their spouse. You know, the flirty looks, the gentle touches, the first time you see them undress, the first time that you were together, and just massive amounts of dopamine hitting your system. Well, guess what? After 5, 6, 7, 8 years, it's not as much. The dopamine hit is not as big. What's actually happened, God designed now for oxytocin to jump in and to build a deeper, more lasting relationship. But what far too often happens is guys are seeking that dopamine hit again. And so all of a sudden you start going into a boardroom, looking at somebody, and they look at you and your feet touch. And, you know, you've heard it said a lot of times, affairs don't start in a bedroom, they start in a boardroom, or in David's case, with a little walk on the roof. You got to make sure you're not trying to feed that dopamine. Getting back, by the way, let's say that you do end up doing what too many people, stupid people do, end up in an affair. You divorce your wife. Now you're 5 years down the track with this young lady. Guess what? Same thing's going to happen anatomically, where it's going to convert over from dopamine to oxytocin, and you're going to be looking for that dopamine hit again, which is why far too often second and third marriages don't last.
And I also want to hit on, you often hear, this goes back to your point, well, court your wife, right? And pursue her. You hear that in every marriage seminar, right? You got to pursue your wife, pursue your wife. What does that tangibly look like? What does that mean? What I would tell people, and this is going to sound really selfish, pursue yourself a little bit. You let yourself go because you think you got your wife because she was the end goal. As a man, your wife doesn't respect that when she's the end goal. You have to have something that is beyond her. You have to have something that is bigger than her. You have to be pursuing your own goals, because if you pursue her and you finally get her, where do you go from there? Now you can only ever maintain. Whereas if you go out and you conquer and you take your role, and we've talked about this in masculinity, I don't want to get too much into this, but in the masculinity podcast, this idea of taking dominion, part of the weight gain is because you think that your goal is your wife and you got her. So your goal is done. And then it's just maintaining that marriage. Whereas if you look at it and you say, my goal is to take dominion in every aspect of my life because that's what I'm called to do. My wife will follow and she will be a helpmeet in the process. Things go a lot better. Pursue your relationship with God, pursue your relationship with yourself, which sounds really weird and it sounds very selfish, but it's like, I realize the two become one flesh. The problem is we stop caring about the individual, and individuals are what make the marriage go. So this whole idea of you complete me because I come with 50% and you come with 50%. Wrong. Because when she lets down, and we've mentioned this before, so again, we can move on here in a second, but when she lets down on her 50% and she's only given 35%, bitterness sets in because, hey, you were supposed to complete me. Now I'm only 85% whole because you're letting down your end of the deal. No. You come 100%. She comes to the marriage 100%, and together you make something completely different. But that way, if she is having a tough day, she's having a tough month, whatever it may be, whatever things you go through, you're 100% individual. So I know we're taking it into the marriage, and I do want to bring it back around to the sexual, because that is what this is about. But
let me jump in here to transition this. Since the COVID lockdowns 2.5 years ago, it is really a shame how many people I know, Facebook friends, real, like friends I'm close with, who have had marital struggles, divorce, affairs, whatever else. I mean, just lots of problems, lots of people you see just aren't together anymore. And so some of the things that came about from that. And so you've got some things you want to get into here that kind of are hindrances, things that maybe start creating the environment for affair, if not satisfied at home, of looking somewhere else for it, but also just, again, where you're not connecting, you're not clicking together as a couple. And so let's get to some of those before we kind of shift gears into the reproductive side.
Absolutely. So if you look around the average auditorium, most married people do not look happy. And folks, that is such a problem.
They look miserable in many cases.
They really don't look happy. And so the message that we're sending a lot of the young people is, hey, we want you to stay, abstinent until marriage. And oh, by the way, once you get in marriage, this is what you can look forward to, look like you're sucking lemons. That is not it. My understanding is I'm probably supposed to do a hot take, kind of like Joe. So
Watch yourself
here's
now.
my
You can call it something
That's
else.
his area. Yeah.
That's right. You
here's
call it
my
something
hot
else.
take. Here's my hot take. Stop having so many stinking church programs that we are interfering with the health and the flourishing of Christian marriages. In fact, I would recommend everybody listening to this think of one activity that you can give up, whether it be a visitation program or a certain youth thing or whatever. And I know right now there are probably preachers and elders that are sucking air for oxygen, thinking, how in the world could he tell somebody not to do these things? I can tell them that because we've got marriages failing all across our country. We've got young people looking at these marriages thinking, why do I want that? Maybe it's time we invest some time in marriages and less time in these programs.
And that's what's so frustrating. And Dad, I want you to get into the things that can hinder a healthy sex life here after this. But that's what's so frustrating is the person that, always tries at least to look at it from the perspective of young people. We hammer and hammer as we should, like you said, stay abstinent. Don't, no sexual activity outside of, before you get married. But then again, you got young people that are looking at Christian married people. And if the depressing part about this is you think about your average congregation and you ask your young people, hey, can you name 5 examples of what looks like a healthy, happy married couple? Can you name 5? I think, again, generalized statement, this is maybe a bit stereotypical, but I think a lot of young people would struggle to find that. And that's what's so saddening is that, again, we're going to tell them, don't have sex outside of marriage, wait till marriage. We should, of course. But at the same time, they're looking around going, there's no examples of happy, healthy marriages. Why would that be something that I run towards? And we wonder why young men are delaying marriage till 25, 26, 27. It's just a nasty cycle, a vicious cycle that we're in. And the church, again, is not doing a lot to stop it.
No, and in fact, what we're doing is we're filling up our calendars with all these activities and programs, thinking that if we have a full calendar that means we're active and we're doing great things for Christ. But we don't realize we're actually separating and fragmenting families, which is a problem. We are causing marriages to crumble because there's no time to feed them, fertilize them, and for husband and wife to be intimate. And
I'm
so
going to add
again, think of an activity that you can give up, even if it is a church activity. Now, obviously, I would go secular activity first, but there's some of you out there that you're involved in every single activity a church offers, visitation, youth, all the different programs that are out there. You need to give some of those up and focus on your marriage.
I'm going to add to your hot take on the back end of how many of those programs are based around children. This is for the kids. This is for the youth, right? This is it, and it makes us feel youthful and it makes us feel good because we're doing a lot for the kids. It actually mirrors the same thing that you see in the families, as we've already touched on, which is it's all about the kids. It's all about the kids. No, it's not. It's not. The family structure is built on strong men and women, strong marriages, not strong children. That's fantastic. That's great. You will not hear us say anything against raising up your children unto the Lord. That's absolutely what should happen. They cannot be the same way that a man's main mission cannot be his wife. It has to be outside of her because, she has to have something to follow. She can't be the top of the food chain. It's a hierarchical issue there. Same thing when you make it all about the kids, and churches make it all about the kids. I'm not going to go off on VBS again. Everybody knows my take on it, but it is all about the kids. And why aren't we doing more, as you're talking about, to help Christian marriages? And I'm not talking programs, maybe some Bible classes, but like you said, be willing to take a step back from a couple of these programs and show your kids what a good marriage looks like. You want to help them? Don't send them to another youth function with pizza and laser tag. Let them watch you at home as a solid married couple, communicating back and forth, studying the Word of God, going on things as a family and showing them what a healthy marriage looks like. That's one of the best things you can do for your kid. Stop delegating it to the church and thinking that if I say a couple nice things about marriage every once in a while, that will overcome the mountain of negativity they see from mom and dad at home. It's not going to happen. So we come back to, and you've already touched on the first one, which is The things that hinder a good sex life, first, I think, is busyness. I think that's the point you're driving at here is
big time.
busyness and too much
You
on the
got to make
schedule. What
time.
else?
You got to make time. And you guys touched on this very well last time, the guilt concept where, for 18, 20 years, you tell a kid, no, 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 that's bad, 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 bad. And then you try to flick a light switch and go, oh, okay, now enjoy this. Well, guess what? You can't undo 18 years of guilt and negativity overnight. And so you got a lot of folks who get into their marriage and there's a pretty hefty guilt complex associated with sex. Will, that's one of the reasons why when your siblings, you guys, I think were all 11 when we did the passport for purity. We wanted to wait long enough for you to be old enough to comprehend, understand, accept it in a mature way, but also young enough so that you could start forming good feelings about it for when you do get married. And so that your marriage night, your marriage week, your first year would not just be a whole thing of, oh, should I really be doing this? Is this right? The whole guilt complex. Obviously, we talked about the exhaustion thing, and there again, that's one of the things. So I'm a little bit older than you guys. I know that. One of the things
Just a little bit.
One of the things that you're going to find is life comes in waves or chapters. And so there are going to be chapters of your life where you're a lot more busy and you have to take stock and say, you know what, we need to slow down. We need to get rid of some of this stuff. We need to do things. Learn to identify those early on in your marriages. Learn to look around and go, you know what, we are just, man, we're just going from one thing to the next. We need to slow down and enjoy each other. Jack, Joe, what about angerness and bitterness, resentment when it comes to a hindrance in sex?
Yeah, I mean, if that exists and then you've got to go perform that, again, it becomes a duty at that point. Neither one of you is enjoying it. We talked last week where sometimes for the guy, it can almost feel like you're violating the woman, your wife, if she doesn't want to be a part of it, if there's not a connection there. And so that's not a healthy thing.
You've also got fear. You got a lot of folks who, because they went 18, 20 years with this unknown, there's a whole fear side of it. External problems with work, stress, that kind of thing. One of the things that Christians don't ever talk about is just the ignorance of sex, because we don't talk about this area. And because we don't talk about human anatomy, and because dads don't have real life conversations with their sons or daughters about the human body and what to expect, a lot of times there's just flat out ignorance, and that will definitely hinder a healthy sex life.
Well,
Joe,
and also, yeah, I also want to get in on that because I think there's willful ignorance as well. And there's this kind of like, the approved method, the approved way is the missionary position with the lights off. That's what Christians do. And it's like, there's so much more to the world of sex. There's so many different positions to try. It's about enjoying sex with one another. But it's like so many Christians do want to stay in the dark, metaphorically speaking, physically and metaphorically speaking. And they want to pretend that other sexual positions are dirty, are wrong, or whatever it may be. And so we kind of stay ignorant in this area. And then because we're ignorant, we think that when we go to pass it down to our kids and discuss this, right, and have these talks with them about it, we're ignorant ourselves and we feel really weird about it ourselves. And so it's kind of, once again, we stay a little more in the dark on that, willfully, seemingly. I don't know if that's something you've run across, but it very much seems like that.
And then, Joe, as I mentioned, you pointed out great last week, insecurity, whether it be insecurity about the female and her body, insecurity about performing, whatever. But all of these are things that can hinder a healthy sex life. And these are things that we have to be aware of and things that we need to address.
I want to add one more on the end, just from a therapy perspective, and that is shame. You talked about guilt, but I think there's a lot of shame surrounding past sexual behavior. There's a lot of sexual abuse in the church that's not discussed. This is not, we're not going into this on the podcast too much, but this is a real problem in the church. I can tell you horror stories from many Christians who have come to see me, for my services, that they come into counseling and things kind of seem okay on the surface. And the more you dig into their past, it's like, whoa, the church hid some major sexual abuse scandal that they happen to unfortunately be a part of, be caught in, and devastating, right? And there's a lot of shame surrounding those things, but they can't tell anyone. And so they get into marriage, and maybe they're shamed from past molestation, whatever it is, or because we have this tendency to shame people for, sleeping together outside of marriage, there is a guilt aspect. That is not right. It's fornication. It's a sin. But we can make any sexual sin the cardinal sin. And so if you have a past with anything concerning homosexuality, anything concerning sleeping together outside marriage, anything concerning a major porn addiction issue that you have overcome or are working to, that can also hinder a sex life where you struggle to open up because you feel very shameful about what you've done. In which case, I would say, get yourself some therapy. You need to learn to accept forgiveness from God, recognizing that if you've repented and you're coming out of that, then, and you've turned away from that there is absolutely forgiveness. But there's also a lot of trauma surrounding those things, and working through trauma can be difficult. So that I would throw that on as well.
So we're not gonna have time to get the reproductive discussion into this one. We might have to push that to another one. Bring Brad back. And I apologize. My daughter is trying to make her podcast debut from the other room. Sorry, hollering. But what you get at there, Joe, with shame and church teaching and all that, and I guess we'll kind of shoot this tangent as we get towards the end of this discussion, purity culture. There's been a lot of criticism of purity culture. In fact, when I posted that we were going to talk about this, when he brought up I Kissed Dating Goodbye and how it was wholly negative, and I think a lot of people look at, oh man, purity culture got me a whole backwards view on sex. And when you look at it, having a purity culture is a good thing. Teaching young kids, hey, it's not good to go sleep with a bunch of people, and this will have consequences down the road in your marriage. It's going to create baggage that you're going to bring into it. Diseases, endorphins. Yeah, I mean, children come out of it, or abortions that come out of it from covering up, or just bad things. And so it's an important thing to push. On the other hand, I think that's the critique that some people have, is it went too far. It didn't create a healthy view of sex or whatever else. And so I know you're well familiar, Brad, with Josh Harris, who's since gone off the reservation and all that, but I Kissed Dating Goodbye, all the stuff that was purity culture. What are your thoughts?
So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind, as you read through the Old Testament, God expects us to remain pure. You think about what would happen to a female who was impure and her husband charged her with that. She was stoned in her father's doorway. I don't think God changed his view on purity just because Jesus went to the cross. And so, yes, I do feel like we need to promote purity. And here's the thing. I think during my lifetime, when I was 15, 16, 17, basically the message the church was saying is, don't have sex. Here's the sex line. And what everybody did was we tried to get as close to that line as we could. Oftentimes, many people went over the line. And so, unfortunately, sometimes the pendulum swings hard back the other way, and folks are like, oh, no, now we gotta teach them to cover up and wear burqas and not touch somebody. There's a healthy balance to where you can get to know someone. Sure, you can hold somebody's hand, you can put your arm around somebody, you can remain pure in the eyes of God and still start to understand what the opposite sex is about. You can still start feeling some of those hormone feelings and not have the PTSD, as people would say, they've got from remaining pure. We're going to continue to teach purity in our household, and it's something that I think God is very serious about.
The problem, I think, with the purity culture, I 1,000% agree. Of course, we need to teach more of it. The problem with purity culture was the false promises made along the way. If you are pure, you are going to have the greatest sex life and the greatest marriage there ever is. And so people remain pure, and then they get there. There is ignorance, all the things we just discussed. There's ignorance, there's fear, there's just a general lack of understanding about sex, but also, oh yeah, I didn't know that my husband struggled with porn. And so all these false promises, like as a woman, as a girl, I kept myself pure and I kept myself away from all these things. And I didn't go off the reservation and I didn't, dress immodestly at the pool and all of these things. Like I saved myself. I deserve to have the man of my dreams, deserve to have the wedding that is, Cinderella's wedding. Well, that happens. You keep yourself pure, and all of these false promises made by the purity culture movement, they don't work out. We realize they're false promises. My marriage is terrible. We have marital issues all the time. We don't get along. He's, sexually backwards, whatever it is. Even though he say, we kept ourselves clean. Yeah, but you didn't know that he had been molested, in his childhood, whatever it is. And so I think that was people's big problem with purity culture is the false promises. And so a lot of people, once again, everything operates on a pendulum seemingly. It swung back to where we are now, where we don't teach purity. There is a balance to be had where purity is fantastic. And I would very much be on the train of, I wouldn't hardly hold hands before marriage, to be quite honest with you, because as you referenced earlier, it awakened something in me. I did sleep with Alyssa before marriage. I'm not proud of it. It wasn't good. It was, a matter of fact, it was horrible. Everything that came out of it and all the issues, and we had to work through things, even after marriage of some of the guilt and everything surrounding that. So that's a warning. However, I would say that very much was awakened when we started holding hands, and then it goes into stroking the arm, and then it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. I didn't have self-control the way I should have. I'm not saying if you hold hands, you're going to be sleeping with one another, but it does awaken things. We ought to be able to have these conversations without making the promises that everything is going to be great and your marriage is going to be 1,000% fantastic. That's not always the case.
Well, and we're going to have a courtship dating for young people episode at some point. I don't want to turn the close of this episode into that. But I think everything that y'all are saying is exactly right in the sense that it's maybe it's not necessarily that we don't teach purity anymore. It's just that, as I brought up numerous times before, we put our young people in just about every opportunity that we can to not be pure. We push them towards relationships at age 15. We push them towards dating culture, all the while in the church, still under the premise of, but you got to stay pure, make sure and stay pure, but, go be by yourself with your girlfriend and boyfriend for hours upon end. And so, again, that's a discussion that we're going to have at a later time. But
well, and let's make sure everybody out there understands, if we do it God's way, it's going to work. It's best. He doesn't want us to get diseases. He doesn't want us to get emotionally and physically attached to somebody who is not our spouse. One of the things that we haven't mentioned is endorphins that are released. So, I'm a child of the 80s, and there are songs that when they play, unfortunately, my mind doesn't immediately go to my wife, because maybe they were a song that was the theme of a prom that I went to with somebody else. That's not a great thing. When my body is releasing endorphins from a song that I went to a prom with somebody else with, that's not a positive, pure, God intended kind of deal. And so these are the things that we need to make sure we're communicating to the next generation, so that when a song comes on, they're not going to have this neurochemical rush because of somebody they were with who's not their spouse 20, 30 years ago.
I don't think we're going to get to a lot of the questions that Christians have about birth control, about more so the reproduction side of sex, fertility issues, IVF. Those are very, very needed discussions. A lot of questions we have on that. So I believe the plan is to push that to next week on another episode featuring, again, Brad Harrub. I'll call him Dad, but featuring Brad Harrub. So we encourage you to stay tuned for that, as we will have a part 3 of this. Yeah, go ahead.
Before you guys kick me off, I do want to throw out real quickly. We talked about the hindrances of healthy sex life. Let me make sure everybody understands there are physical, anatomical, neurological benefits of sex. You get unity, you get pleasure, you get obviously reproduction that we're going to talk about next time. You reaffirm your identity, the release of tension, those kinds of things. So, folks, what we're talking about is a good thing. It was created by God. Look forward to talking to you guys next time about reproduction and all the other aspects.
We'll be back next week with one more on the sex series. I guess that'll make it 3 in the series, and hopefully we'll have done it justice by then. But again, thanks to everybody for tuning in. Thanks again for Brad for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.